I'm Elizabeth Hinton, chair of the conference committee, and now I would like to invite to the stage the panelists for our opening conversation, moderated by my dear colleague, Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Henry Louis Gates is the Alphonse Fletcher Jr. University professor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. We are all here in no small part thanks to Professor Gates. And one of the most important things the Hutchins Center has done is to put up half the funds to acquire the papers of Angela Y. Davis. Thank you, Skip. Professor Gates will be joined by Fania E. Davis, consultant and founding director emerita of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth and sister of Angela Davis, Margaret Burnham, University Distinguished Professor of Law and director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, Northeastern University School of Law, who has known Angela Davis since they were both children in Birmingham and served as one of Angela Davis's lawyers during her trial, and Bettina Aptheker, Distinguished Professor and University of California Presidential Co-Chair in Feminist Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, UC Santa Cruz, and Angela Davis's co-author and colleague. Skip, I will hand it over to you and invite the panelists to come to the stage.
Right. Thank you, dear. Where do you want me to sit? Over here?
Yeah, yes.
Beautiful. Is this on? Great. Please give it up to Terry Lynn Carrington. That was amazing. I'm Henry Louis Gates, Jr., and it's my pleasure to be with you here this afternoon for the opening panel of Radical Commitments, the Life and Legacy of Angela Davis. Give it up for Angela Davis, please. A conference organized by my dear colleague, Professor Elizabeth Hinton. Give it up for Professor Hinton, please. And I also want to acknowledge two other individuals and two institutions. Radcliffe Dean, Tomiko Brown Nagin. And Jane Kamensky, Carl and Lily Forsheimer Foundation, Director of the Schlesinger Library. As well as, of course, the staffs of both the Schlesinger Library and the Radcliffe Institute for making this conference possible. Please give it up to the staff, especially Becky Wasserman. We've gathered here today to mark an historic occasion. The acquisition of the papers of Angela Y. Davis by the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe and the Hutchins Center. Those papers are now available for use by scholars and researchers. Friday. Those papers will be available for use by scholars and researchers on Friday at 9 a.m. Is that the right thing? Okay, great. Interest in Angela Davis's life and legacy has never been greater or more relevant to where, unfortunately, we find ourselves in this country today. We need you. We needed you then, Angela. We need you more today. Now, I've admired Angela ever since Herbert Marcuse mentioned her as his most brilliant student. Now, I had become acquainted with Marcuse's work as an undergraduate at Yale when I was assigned the 1960 edition of his classic 1941 text, Reason and Revolution, but as a sophomore by a political science professor named Isaac Kramnik. Now, although his 1955 Eros and Civilization is more widely read, no doubt because of the word Eros in the title, it was the other volume, in particular, Marcuse's preface to the 1960 edition that transformed my own understanding of revolution as rational and strategic, not irrational or spontaneous. Believe it or not, we were studying Reason in Revolution precisely when Bobby Seale was on trial for murder in the New Haven courthouse, just a block away from our classroom. And I'm getting to Erica in a minute. In 1969, along with Erica Huggins. Now, the connection between Davis and Marcuse becomes clearest, perhaps, in the preface to the 1960 edition, in which Marcuse claims that the purpose of dialectical or negative thinking is to expose and then overcome by revolutionary action the contradictions by which advanced industrial societies are constituted. And thank you, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for refreshing my memory. Now, this idea encompasses both the dominant social and psychological mechanisms employed to ingrain such contradictions of wealth and poverty, of freedom and incarceration in a capitalist society. It is these mechanisms that Davis has sought to dismantle, ladies and gentlemen, for her entire career, and we are all indebted to you, Angela, for doing that. In fact, Angela Davis is one of the major political theorists of the last century, and whether one agrees with her opinions or not, there is no gainsaying her prominent place in the history of American political thought. Her critique of the prison system, for instance, and its effects on the African-American community was prophetic. You got there long before so many others did. Her case was, for some of us, a primer in criminal injustice. We were concerned about how the criminal justice system was treating her. Numerous black intellectuals and black intellectual life in general were inspired by those momentous days and months surrounding your arrest, your incarceration, and eventually your trial. My own intellectual growth was sparked by you, for sure. Because of you, I actually enrolled in a philosophy course and quickly discovered that I was not meant to be a philosopher. And when I returned to Yale after a year abroad in Africa, I proudly hung a Free Angela poster on my dorm room wall, right next to posters urging us to free Bobby, free Erica, and free Mandela. When I would later, eventually, to my amazement, actually meet Angela Davis, I learned that Angela Davis, like Erica, like Bobby, like Nelson Mandela, had always been free. I wasn't the only one captivated by her power of thought and courage in action. As some of you may know, the great and now heartbreakingly late Toni Morrison worked closely with Angela when Morrison was still toiling on the editorial side at Random House. Looking back at their friendship years later, Morrison said, working with Angela was sui generis. And I didn't just edit her book. I went on her book tour with her. I was her handler all over. She said, this was before I was Toni Morrison. She continues, we were in Scandinavia at one point, and I was a good handler. People would come up to her, you know, my brother's in prison, and I was wondering, could we have a cocktail party to raise some money for him? And the thing was, Angela would stop and listen and say, where is he? And I would say, Angela, come on, we're late. Before you say the same about this introduction, let me advance our let me advance our program toward the main event. We'll begin with opening statements from each of our three panelists in a moment. But first, I'd like to recognize someone very special to me and to many people in the audience tonight, and that is Professor Dorothy Burnham. Dorothy is, in many ways, the mother of many of the participants of our program, and at the age of 104, ladies and gentlemen, 104, is definitely yep, that's you. She is the matriarch of a long line of incredibly strong women. A civil rights and feminist activist, as well as microbiologist, Dorothy Burnham worked in the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Birmingham with Angela Davis's parents, Sally and Frank, coordinating sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives, and working to integrate public transportation systems and public institutions. Later, she was also active in Women for Racial and Economic Equality, Sisters Against South African Apartheid, Genes and Gender, and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Her dedication and work deeply inspired her 4 children, Claudia, Margaret, who's part of our panel, Linda and Charles, as well as the 4 Davis children, Angela, Ben, Fania, and Reggie. A tireless teacher, activist, humanitarian, and mother, Dorothy Burnham's long advocacy for social justice has influenced and improved the lives of countless people. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Dorothy Burnham. That's great. Thank you. And now we will go to the opening statement, starting with Fania Davis.
Thank you, Skip.
You're quite welcome.
Maybe can you help me with this microphone? Oh, it's on.
There you go.
You can hear me. Great. An African proverb says, "Those who go before us make us who we are." Dorothy was a significant radicalizing influence in my sister's life. Honoring her is a perfect way to open this conference. This beloved centenarian is one of the last living Black radicals of her generation. Dottie, our mother's best friend, is also a mother of our movement, as was said earlier. Tonight, my mother is beside her. The seed planted and cultivated decades ago by these 2 phenomenal Black women instilled in Angela the belief we could create a better world. And this seed has developed into the towering radical Black feminist and abolitionist Angela is today. Many radicalizing elements nurtured that seed. Being born and coming of age in Birmingham with all its bombings meant to terrorize activists in the rising civil rights movement. Living atop Dynamite Hill, a neighborhood targeted because Black families dared move into this all-white area. As a child, being awakened by dynamite blasts demolishing nearby homes, the sight of our father grabbing his gun to protect his family from racial terrorists lurking nearby. Suffering the loss of 2 of my closest friends in the 1963 Birmingham Sunday school bombing. Learning to read our first words, colored and white, on the signs of bathroom doors and water fountains in Birmingham, playing games that were acts of resistance. Forced to climb the back stairs and sit in the balcony of the local theater, we threw popcorn and poured Coca-Cola onto white heads below. Crossing the racial dividing line, we'd ring the doorbell of a white person's home and then run back across the street as fast as possible to escape before the door opened. Another, Angela and I were learning French. And while downtown one day, we pretended to be French-speaking people from Martinique. Using a vieux French accent, we inquired about shoes in an upscale store. The clerk seated us in the front of the store and rolled out the red carpet. After a few minutes of trying on the shoes and communicating in strained English, we burst out laughing. The clerks laughed along politely, then asked, "What's so funny?" In our black Southern English, we replied, "All us black people got to do is pretend we from another country, and you treat us like we dignitaries." We laughed our way out of the store. The seeds of black radicalism planted in Birmingham were nurtured steadily and began growing into a strong tree. Angela attended a progressive high school in New York, became active in a youth group allied with the Communist Party, engaged in solidarity actions with the rising sit-in movements, attended Marxist lectures by historian Herbert Aptheker, read the Communist Manifesto, studied revolutionary political philosophy with Herbert Marcuse at Brandeis, pursued critical theory graduate studies in Frankfurt, taught Marxist philosophy at UCLA while enduring hundreds of death threats daily, engaged in community organizing with the Black Panther Party and Che Lumumba Club, an all-black collective of the Communist Party, led a campaign to free prison activist George Jackson and the Soledad brothers. She was then fired by Governor Ronald Reagan for this radical activism. When the court overruled the firing, the state targeted her for execution. Capital kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder charges arose out of the events of August 7th, 1970, when George Jackson's brother Jonathan took over a courtroom with guns in Marin County, freed prisoners, took hostages, demanded the freedom of his brother, and attempted to escape in a van. Firing a hail of bullets into it, officers killed Jonathan, 2 prisoners, and the judge. Jonathan's guns were registered in Angela's name, and the state seized upon this to prosecute an attempt to eliminate her. After 2 months underground on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, Angela was captured. President Nixon immediately publicly cheered and branded Angela a terrorist. From that day forward, we, her family and comrades, worked nonstop with countless others, building an international movement formidable enough to save my sister's life. Along with me, seasoned black communist organizers such as Charlene Mitchell, Franklin and Kendra Alexander, and Latinx organizer Victoria Mercado. And can we just honor them? The last 3 are ancestors now. Can we just honor them?
Sure.
They all played leading roles. We assembled an amazing, mostly black legal team, including Margaret, with Bettina as legal advisor and historian. The Communist Party activated its impressive global network, mobilizing millions. During the 20 months after Angela's arrest, I ceaselessly spoke and organized throughout many US cities and the world. My baby Angela Issa, right over there, was only 3 months old. When leaving her with my mother, I went on tour to speak to hundreds of thousands at demonstrations in Montreal, London, Berlin, Helsinki, Rome, Moscow, Santiago de Chile, and many other cities, including a mobilization of 60,000 in Paris. And you've seen those images, I believe, in the exhibit. The cry to free Angela reverberated throughout the world. Millions of ordinary people mobilized themselves. Black women, butchers, fighters, teachers, electricians, black police officers, even Appalachian coal miners for Angela. Free Angela stickers and Angela afros were omnipresent. How many of you had Angela afros out there? All right. Musicians dedicated songs, we heard some of them, and playwrights plays. School children launched massive letter writing campaigns. Celebrities stepped up, like Aretha Franklin, who offered to put up $250,000 in bail, saying she didn't believe in communism, but believed in freedom for black people, just like Angela did. The spectacular Free Angela and All Political Prisoners movement enriched the soil for the tree whose seeds and fruits became the prisoners' rights, anti-mass incarceration, and abolitionists and other organizations of today. Also, today's transformative and restorative justice movements, of which I am a part, are fruit of the abolitionist impulse to create alternatives to the carceral state. Though many have researched the movements Angela helped engender, few have written about the movement that freed her, making possible its progeny. Movements that today are growing their own trees. With the Schlesinger Library's acquisition of Angela's papers, this will change. So, from the seeds of her beginnings in Birmingham, a great tree has come forth, one that has engendered new seedlings in the magnificent bourgeoning movements of young people of our time. And so it is, from childhood to family, to community, to adulthood, to elderhood, and then back again, the return of the ancestors, tracing the spiral of life and the never-ending quest for freedom.
Thank you. Oh, that's fabulous. That's great. Margaret?
Thank you. Thank you, Fania. Thank you so much. I want to, first of all, thank the organizers of this conference, thank the Schlesinger Library and the Radcliffe Institute and the Huggins Institute for this historic acquisition and for this conference. I want to acknowledge Fania's recognition of our parents, Louis and Dorothy Burnham, and Sally and B. Frank Davis, and Herb and Fan Aptheker, and the Pattersons as well, William Patterson and Louise Patterson. You know, when you're a kid, you don't know who your parents are in the world. And then you get in the world, you know, there are people who tell you what to do and what not to do, but then you get out in the world and you realize, oh, that's who they are. And the Davises and the Burnhams had a very close friendship, especially the women. Not so much the guys, but certainly Sally and my mother had a very close and enduring and long friendship. And, you know, we finally realized that it was a bond that was forged in fire in Alabama, in their work in Alabama. And we were a rambling bunch of 8 kids from Birmingham to Brooklyn, and out of that, our friendships blossomed, and certainly when Angela was arrested in October of 1970, I went to the jail to see my friend. So I was, at that point, a lawyer. We were both in our mid-20s. And as I think back on that work and the case, I really see 3 different phases of the case. The first I would call Angela the prisoner, and the second, Angela the political prisoner, and the third, Angela the political icon. So the first phase is really Angela's period of incarceration at the Women's House of Detention in New York, which lasted just about 3 months. But until you've been in prison, you don't know prison. You don't know the silence, you don't know the noise, you don't know the dirt, you don't know the community, you know nothing. You can talk about it, you can theorize about it, but Angela was actually in prison. And it was those 3 months really that shaped and formed her, put prison in her bones and in her blood in a way that could not otherwise have happened. And I say she was Angela the prisoner because it was a period of time in which she was not in solitary. She was in that community. She saw those women, she worked with them, she slept with them, she ate with them, she pained with them. And that has informed and bleeded through all of her work since those months in New York City. After that, the next period that I would bracket would be her period in solitary confinement when she was in Marin prison first and then in San Jose for a period of over 11 months. And I call that Angela the political prisoner because she relied so heavily on people like George Jackson to learn how to live in solitary confinement. And it was George who said, you know, You exercise for 5 hours, you sleep for 3 hours, you study and you read and you write for all the remaining hours. And that's what Angela did. That's what she did. And she grew her voice, she grew her confidence, and she began talking not just about prisoners in California, but prisoners all over the country and all over the world. The third period I would call Angela the political icon. And it relates back to what Fania has talked about, the movement that we grew over Angela's from the moment of her incarceration until the moment of her freedom. And, you know, when she got out of jail, we had the wind at our back because of that movement. And it was a point at which Angela, too, agreed, I'm not going back to jail. I'm free. I want to be free. And we knew at that point that if we kept pushing, that she would, and until bail, we did not know it. But once we got that bail, and once she got out, and I'm telling stories out of school now, but we're all family here. So when she got out, she put the books down for a little while. She wasn't reading. She wasn't writing. She was listening to Herbert Hancock. She was in the street. My girl was in the street for a little while. She was enjoying her life, and she wasn't going back.
Hey, that's
she
great.
Wasn't going back. So when I think about my own role in this case, from the very inception as Angela's longtime friend, and then as her lawyer, I thought my role was really to keep her mind set on her own freedom. Because as I think back on it in those initial days in the house of detention, I think really Angela didn't really see the light at the end of the tunnel, that she saw that this was going to be lifetime incarceration or the electric chair, that those were the options. And our job as her lawyers, as her friends, as her family, was to get her to believe that we could win this, that we could do this, that she could be out here 50 years later, 7 or 8 books later, and be the voice of our movement for 50 years. Our job was to get her to believe that. Now, I just want to finish up by reading two statements that Angela made to show the distance that we had to travel and that she had to travel. Here's her statement in October of 1970. The bourgeois, she had just been arrested, the bourgeois press seized upon my recent capture by the federal pigs as an occasion to inject more confusion into the minds of the American public. Regardless of what degrees I have, regardless of my external appearance and my physical makeup, the reality is this. The reactionary pig forces of this country have chosen to persecute me because I am a communist revolutionary participating together with millions of oppressed people in a revolutionary movement to overthrow all the conditions that stand in the way of our freedom. All true, all strong, all beautiful. Not speaking to any jurors who are going to be on our jury in Santa Clara County. September 22nd, 1971, here's Angela's statement. I write on the eve of trial. As that date draws near, the need to ensure judicial fairness and bail in order that I may better prepare my defense becomes increasingly urgent. While we may disagree on many things, we are surely united in our affirmation of principles of due process and equality before the law. Millions of people throughout the world of all political persuasions and national and racial origin have voiced their concern over the fairness of my trial. And then she cites the support statement from the California Federation of Teachers. So if you think about those two statements, how do we get there? Angela carried herself there, number one, and the movement carried her there. She knew that she had a deep responsibility to all of those who had thrown down their lot with her, and she threw down her lot with them as well. I just want to conclude with a vignette from my time with Angela at the Marin County Jail. She had a cell, a writing cell, and a living cell. They were both jail cells. But her books were all lined up on, it was a bed, and her books were lined up on both sides of the bunk bed, and then she had a little desk in there. And Bettina and I and Fania spent more hours in there than we really care to tell you. On one of those occasions, it was usually one of the three of us, it was usually one of the girls who went in. And on one of those occasions, we took all kinds of people, and her friends, and on one of those occasions, I picked up John Conyers from San Francisco. And he wanted to go out and see Angela. And so the congressman and I get to the place where you give your ID and you tell him who you are, your date of birth and all of that. And he reaches in his pocket and he says, "I didn't bring any ID with me, I'm a congressman." I'm like, "John, you're kidding. We're trying to get in to see the most famous prisoner in the world. Where's your ID?" Long story short, we begged, we pleaded. I think maybe they made a call to Washington, but John Conyers came in. And we had a lovely visit with Angela, and after that, he issued a marvelous statement. And he was a friend of Angela's and of our committee, NUCFAD, for years thereafter.
Oh, beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Beautiful. Bettina Aptheker.
We're dropping stuff here. Well, I'm feeling very emotional. It is a joy to be here this evening and to have been invited to be on this panel and to partake in the richness of this conference. And I thank you. Okay, I'm together.
Take your time.
Angela, Margaret, and I first met each other as children. Our families intertwined through our parents' radical and, shall we say, subversive activities. When the three of us were in high school, all of us living in Brooklyn, we were members of a socialist youth organization called Advance, which is a very optimistic title. This was in the late 1950s, early 1960s. We met in the basement of my parents' home. The part of the basement where we met was finished and furnished. The other part had a cement floor, a washing machine, and a clothesline, and all the way in the rear was the boiler room. Under the clothesline, there were rows of metal filing cabinets. These contained the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois. He and Shirley Graham Du Bois were soon to depart for Ghana. In that time of McCarthyism and House committees on un-American activities and virulent racism and anti-communism, no university library would touch Du Bois's papers. Mm-hmm. He left them with my father until they could be properly housed in a university library, should such a time ever come. Mm-hmm. These are the papers that now fill the archive of the W.E.B. Du Bois Library at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Mm-hmm. In this way, ever so young, I learned a powerful lesson about the significance of archives, a treasure trove of incalculable value. What a gift of radical commitment it is today for the Schlesinger Library to house the papers of Angela Davis.
Amen.
Angela was arrested on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list warrant on October 13th, 1970. 5 weeks later, many of you may recall that James Baldwin wrote an open letter to my sister, Angela Davis. Quote, "The enormous revolution in black consciousness which has occurred in your generation, my dear sister, means the beginning or the end of America. Some of us, white and black, know how great a price has already been paid to bring it into existence, a new consciousness, a new people, an unprecedented nation. If we know and do nothing, we are worse than the murderers hired in our name. If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they shall be coming for us that night. Therefore, peace. Brother James." Mm-hmm. Angela was incarcerated for about 485 days, I actually counted, before she was finally released on bail February 23rd, 1972, which also happens to be Dr. Du Bois's birthday.
That's true.
And 5 days before the start of her trial. In that time, she studied and wrote and published an astonishing body of work. Together, Angela and I compiled and edited a book called If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance. How we managed to do this without being able to exchange papers unless the lawyers were there, as Margaret was describing, and drafts of essays with each other, and often a plexiglass barrier between us, is another story. In her opening essay, Political Prisoners, Prisons, and Black Liberation, Angela began to redefine who was a political prisoner. Of course, she referenced Nat Turner and John Brown and Dr. Du Bois, as in the mid-20th century was arrested, and scores of others as classic examples of what is meant by a political prisoner. But she also observed, quote, prisoners, especially blacks, Chicanos, and Puerto Ricans, are increasingly advancing the proposition that they are political prisoners, in the sense that they are largely the victims of an oppressive politico-economic order, swiftly becoming conscious of the causes underlying their victimization. We documented the trials of Huey Newton, Erica Huggins, Bobby Seale, Ruchelle McGee, the Soledad brothers, and so on, using their own voices, with their own words. Here then, Angela had already begun to call attention to the politics of mass incarceration and the articulation of the prison abolition movement. The book was translated into dozens of languages and published all over the world. At the same time, Angela was writing a definitive essay called The Reflections of Black Women's Role in the Community of Slaves, published in the Black Scholar in December 1971, and dedicated to the memory of George Jackson. In it, she challenged the then quite popular idea of the black woman as matriarch, as a collaborator in her own and her community's enslavement. Quote, the designation of the black woman as a matriarch is a cruel misnomer. It is a misnomer because it implies stable kinship structures within which the mother exercises decisive authority. It is cruel because it ignores the profound traumas the black woman must have experienced when she had to surrender her childbearing to alien and predatory economic interests. Angela went on to discuss and document black women's resistance, redefining resistance, and building it into the everyday lives of the enslaved community. Here in this essay, Angela helped inaugurate what was to become the ground-shattering field of black feminist studies. Invited to give a paper for a symposium sponsored by the Society for the this is a mouthful, the Philosophical Study of Dialectical Materialism. You remember that? Oh, God. Okay. At the American Philosophical Association Convention in New York in December 1971, Angela wrote a 60-page manuscript called Women and Capitalism, Dialectics of Oppression and Liberation. Juliet Mitchell, the British socialist feminist who had written a book on women's liberation called The Longest Revolution, was Angela's co-presenter. Angela, of course, was in jail. I presented a portion of the paper, as best I could, in the 20 minutes allotted to me. The hall where we spoke was packed with hundreds of people. A speakerphone was set up. We telephoned Angela in the judge's chambers. The judge had agreed to this, which was in itself simply amazing. And in this manner, folks asked their questions, and Angela responded. It was one of the most dramatic, moving, astounding experiences for all of us, hushed into an awed silence, listening to her voice, the voice of a brilliant intellectual shamefully imprisoned. Angela's prison's writings are too much to enumerate beyond what I've done here, but in each carefully considered work are the prescient seeds of the subjects for this conference: revolution, feminism, and abolition. After a trial that lasted a little over 3 months, Angela was found not guilty on all counts. It was June 4th, 1972. News of the verdict was broadcast around the world. In Los Angeles, members of the Angela Davis Defense Committee ran through the neighborhood with bullhorns announcing the verdict. Traffic stopped. People rushed from their homes. A few miles away in Watts, Democratic Party presidential hopeful George McGovern addressed an election rally of several thousand. The news swept through the crowd. A chant started way in the back and rolled into a thunderous wave. Power of the people set Angela free.
Beautiful, beautiful. Give it up for our panelists. It's fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. Fania and Margaret, how do you think going to school in the South and then in the North had an effect on Angela, and particularly on a critical distance, giving her a critical distance on the country and the central story of race, gender, and justice in it that are her signature? Was that move important? And it was a move that you made as well. For both of you. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it was really important. Angela always had her eyes on another way of being, another society, another social arrangement. And I think one of the things that she found when she went up north was that there was racism and discrimination and oppression there too. So I imagine it probably expanded her notion of what freedom means, from perhaps freeing her people from racism in the South to freeing black people everywhere, and then to freeing women and other people of color. So I imagine that move from the South had a huge impact on her in that way. And also she was able, in her exposure to Marxist theory, to revolutionary theory, was able to articulate what was wrong and what was needed, very importantly.
Great, thanks. Margaret.
Well, I would just add that I don't think it was just the relationship between her time in the South and her time in New York City and in Brooklyn, but also it was her travels during her college years to France and Germany that created an international humanist that, and the South was very much a part of that. The South was kind of the core of the background, the hardcore of that, but ultimately being able to spread out and understand the commonality and across continents, across geographical space, across time periods, with this grounding in the South was very important.
Margaret, looking back, is there anything that you would have done or handled differently with Angela's case? I mean, the result was spectacular, but I'm just curious in retrospect.
I don't, this is going to sound weird, but I don't think so, because, well, let me just say that Angela played a really critical part in her own defense. She worked carefully with the lawyers, she learned the law, she presented the law, she spoke on her own behalf, gave an opening statement and examined witnesses on her own behalf. So, and we moved her from that statement that she made in October of 1970, which was not designed really to, as I say, to open up a space so that we could actually make a case on her behalf. So she got really deep. I mean, she's an intellectual. So, jury selection. Oh, I want to know all about it. Voir dire. What does that mean? How do we do it? I mean, so she was deeply involved in all aspects. It was a truly collective defense in that sense. And that's so when I say I don't think we made any mistakes, I will also say that she listened to us, but we also had to listen to her and be guided by her. And that presented some very challenging choices for us as lawyers, where with a client less determined to carry about a public defense in a particular way, we would not have been concerned about. And let me just give one example. At the very inception of the case, of course, Angela's case was tied to that of Rochelle McGee,
Yes.
who had been part of the events at San Rafael in August of 1970 that led ultimately to Angela's arrest. That was challenging. We didn't know what kind of defense he was going to present, and we didn't know to what extent it would help or hurt our case. Angela insisted that we handle that with as a political matter, not simply as a legal matter, but that we look at the political implications of that joint defense, and I could give many other examples.
Let me ask the three of you, a sister, you're all like sisters to her in one way or another, but I've always been curious I've known you for a long time, and I knew your father, and I knew your daughter as my student, but I've always wanted to ask the three of you a personal question. What did you learn, if anything, about Angela by watching her go through this experience? And what might those of us outside miss about this story when we read about it in the history books? Could you break it down for us, Bettina?
Because I haven't spoken before. Well, we saw each other, I think, almost every day when you were in jail. I think I was out there pretty much every day. Focus. Angela's capacity to focus with that razor intellect was something I hadn't quite seen before in that way. Stamina, tremendous stamina under enormous pressure from all directions in all different kinds of ways, which is connected to the focus. And then her remarkable compassion. There was an incident with my son, who was only 3 years old at the time, and something that happened at school, and he said something very inappropriate, but he didn't know that. And what it was really about was that I was never home. He was barely 3, and I was gone. And who was Angela? It was like this figment or something, phantom. And she made him, for Christmas, she knitted a cap, a little hat, and a scarf for him, and wrapped it up. And I brought it home, and I said to him, "This is from Angela." And when she got out on bail, she came to our house we lived in San Jose, so our house was sort of the center of everything. Fania lived with us. And when I came in after Angela. Angela was there first, and I came in afterwards, and Margaret's son, Hollis, was sitting on one knee, and Joshua was on the other knee. And they were at the dining room table, as I remember. And boys had this beautiful grin on their faces. They were like lit up like trees. And I thought to myself, yes, Angela has finally come to visit Joshua.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Margaret?
Well, I would say leadership. I would second everything that Bettina's just said, but I would also say that when this case started, Angela, she was not a global leader. And she became that, and she took that on with a kind of, as Bettina says, compassion and dignity and honesty that is what transformed this case and also made her story. A lot of other people would have shunned it, would not have known how to handle it, would have had more ego than was required for that. She had exactly the right amount. You know, I have a position, I have a hardcore, and I mean that in the very best sense of the term. I have a hardcore, I'm not deviating from that, but I'm also flexible. And so she was, it was that kind of leadership that was that emerged over the course of the trial, I think, that what was for me most impressive. Now, let me just give one example. Handling the press, Angela once told me, and I've never forgotten it, that doesn't matter what question the reporter asks you, you have an answer you give.
Right. Right.
But those kind of, those kinds of things that, that made her own her words, I think were very, very unusual.
Beautiful. Fania?
It's kind of a hard question for me to answer because I'm so close. But I would say that her constant refrain, I am who I am because of this movement. It is not me that they are targeting. It is not me who has the ear of the world. It is the movement. And every time she had the opportunity, that was, and I kept hearing that. I still hear that now. And I was talking to someone about the South and how the South, just being an African American and growing up in the 50s and 60s in the South, can itself be radicalizing. And then we started to talk about Condoleezza Rice. Well, actually,
who grew up with you?
Who grew up with us?
Yes.
She went to Arrival High School, and
Right.
she knew.
Well, you might say she still goes to Arrival High School.
Yes, she might. Yes, she might. She knew two of the girls that were killed in the bombing, and
Yes.
we knew the other two.
Yes.
And I was talking to this about Angela, I believe. Angela was saying that she heard her say somewhere when she was speaking on an interview that she was raised to believe that she could be the best, and she must be the best.
Yes.
And the best, better than whites, of course. All of us, many of us blacks, knew that we had to be better than whites.
That was the mantra of the race.
Yeah.
We had to be 10 times better.
We had to be 10 times better.
Right.
But for her, it was 10 times better than anybody, and I have to be on top.
Right.
It was this individualism, just the opposite of what I was talking about earlier, this quality of Angela's sense of collectivity, this sense of, her knowing that knowing that she is who she is because of Dorothy Burnham, because of Louis Burnham, because of the Strongs, because of the Pattersons, because of our ancestors. And she never forgot that. She still does not forget that to say. But I think Condoleezza Rice just didn't have that communitarian understanding.
Could each of you share? It's very interesting to have been a student in the late '60s, to have a room with all those, free this, free that, and then to become a professor and to see political consciousness shift among our students. Can each of you share, particularly with our students, how you became radicalized, how you came to your politics? Now, Bettina had no choice.
A red diaper baby.
No, she is. And for those of you who don't know, W.E.B. Du Bois, our hero and great mentor, picked her father personally to be the executor of his estate. And the worst mistake Harvard University ever had was turning down the offer to buy those papers. And I was determined that wasn't going to happen again with Angela Davis's papers. So would you talk about your evolution in politics, and if you don't mind, each of you?
Well, so this is a conference about Angela, not about us, really.
But we want to hear.
But for me, I went south as a young student after high school, really, after the first year of college, to join the civil rights movement, which was a step my parents had taken, which is what took us to Birmingham in the first place. My parents ultimately got chased out of Birmingham by Bull Connor, and we grew up in New York City. But I ultimately returned to the South because in the early 60s, when I was a young child, that's when that's where the action was. And it was, again, that sort of grounding that became the landscape on which I decided to paint my life.
Right. Fania?
Well, my story is Angela's story. You know, it's really not very different. All of the things that I talked about in my statement, the radicalizing influences, you know, living on Dynamite Hill, living in Birmingham, Alabama, every day, suffering all of the indignities of living in an apartheid society. But it wasn't just that, because as I said earlier, Condoleezza experienced all of that. It was the presence of role models, of inspiring people in the movement all around us. And my mother was, you know, just a real central figure, of course, because she was there every day, reminding us that the world can be a better place and you can make it so with others. And of course, the summers in New York with the Burnhams and the times that they lived with us actually in Alabama, that was a very strong radicalizing influence as well. I mean, they were black communists and brilliant organizers. And I mean, William Patterson, my gosh, and Louise.
Famous.
Yeah. And the Apthekers, you know. So having these people in our lives, these influences, really made a difference for me.
I mean, what was it like for you having these people in your life?
Well, so a lot of stories went through my mind, you know, because a lot of teenagers, you know, and young people rebel. You know, you rebel against your parents.
You could have gone to Harvard Business School.
No, I didn't. I could have.
Investment banker.
Or,
right?
you know, but I didn't. And no offense to anyone here. But I also really wanted to strike out on my own. I wanted to be an independent person. And so that's why I went to Berkeley. But I picked Berkeley because of the students had been washed down the steps of the City Hall in 60 or 61 protesting the House Un-American Activities Committee, which I hated for very good personal reasons, you know. And my dad had been called before the McCarthy Committee in May of '53.
And Du Bois had been arrested.
And Du Bois had been arrested. So these were all things I was very aware of. But I think Berkeley radicalized me in a little bit different way, which is that I developed an independent voice. You see, when you have parents as powerful as I did, and when you were around someone as incredible as Dr. Du Bois, so much of my childhood, there's a way in which and it's also there's gender in there, in case you didn't notice that. You tend to be quiet and so on.
Yes.
So when I got to Berkeley and I was immersed in the politics and so forth, and I'll just tell you one little story there. After we had conducted we took over a police car to prevent someone from being arrested, and they gave speeches from the top of the police car and so on. And then after that, the president of the university, his name was Clark Kerr, said that 49% of the protesters were communists or communist sympathizers. And see, I grew up in the McCarthy period, right? So I'm thinking to myself, well, step back, you know, just step back, just get out of the way, because, you know, I don't want to jeopardize this movement, which was this huge mass movement now with thousands of people. And Mario Savio, who's a dear friend and was also the recognized leader of the movement, slapped his knee at this meeting and he said, I know what to do. We're going to throw the real communists we have right back at him. To my complete astonishment. And so that's what happened was I had nothing, you know, so the next day we held a rally in Sproul Hall, you know, if you don't know Berkeley, it doesn't matter, but we held this rally and he says, talk. We didn't even have microphones then or anything. This was the old soapbox thing. And so I spoke at every rally. And I became this, I don't know. And so, but I developed my own voice is the point I'm trying to make. Because I had to think for myself. And I had to figure out what I thought was appropriate in terms of our tactics and actions and so on. Well,
thank God you went to Berkeley. For the three of you, and we have 5 minutes, And I'm getting a kick here from Elizabeth, who's a very tough person. We have 5 minutes. I'd like to ask each of you two questions, but I want to ask this one first. What are the lessons from Angela Davis's life and political philosophy that you think are important to social movements today, and, since we are in a university, to students and younger generations? Who would like to go first? Bettina.
I'll go first. Go ahead.
I said the professors.
Well, I think what I would say is that that Angela has maintained intellectual North Star, and she has also moved. And so she has written about lots of different things. As we started off this program with her musical contributions. Yeah. And so she has made a mark in many, many different areas. So I mean, I think that that's, that her intellectual and political commitment and her ability and insistence that those two can drive a life, can be a purpose, can fill a decade and 50 is really the lesson for today. That you need to be grounded and be comfortable and in the street, and you also need to be in the books. And you got to do both. You can't do one. You got to do both.
I like the in the streets and the books.
So,
Bettina.
yeah, I've taught at UC Santa Cruz for about 40 years, and Angela for quite a number of years was a colleague, and about 25 of those years, and Gina Dent is my colleague now. And what I wanted to say about it is that I've taught Angela's work in classes over these decades. When I first started, the students knew who she was. You go back 40 years.
Oh, right.
Right?
Right.
Now, only the black students have an inkling of who she is, and they're not 100% sure.
Right.
And the white students probably have almost no, right? Because it's not taught, and they don't know. I'm talking about undergraduates now.
Yes.
And I assign essays that she's written. I talk about her case. I showed the film, Free Angela, we did that.
Yes.
But my point is, I'm just going to tell one little story, and I think it'll capture it. So they really respond to the writing. They respond to who she is. They respond to the story. They see that there's possibilities that they hadn't thought about personally. But one of the things that happened was, I think, Angela, once you came to one of my classes, you've done that more than once, and you were at one of my classes, and you spoke, and one of the students asked you why you were in jail. I don't know if you remember this, but they asked you why you were in jail, and you stayed so kind about it, and you told them very briefly what the story was. And then there was more conversation and so forth, and then you left. The class was more or less ending. And one of the students came up to me afterwards and said, and this was a white student, said to me, "I never thought about the fact that you could do so much with a life."
Wow.
And I think that captures a lot of what happens for young people that we're around all the time as they read and learn and so on. Yeah.
Fania.
Beautiful. So for me, Angela, in her evolution as a human being, as a political activist, as an academic, now understands, and in a big way, that it's important to take care of body, mind, spirit for longevity. So she does yoga, she does Pilates, she meditates, she eats vegan. So, I mean, that sort of learning to take care of ourselves and to keep ourselves healthy and strong is important for us to do the work that we do and to do it for a long time. And I think another lesson is the power of that amazing movement. I mean, you know, in preparing for this, it struck me all over again. That movement to free Angela Davis was just so vast and so powerful and so total that it gives us hope, especially in these times.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the outcome of that trial was greeted like a miracle throughout this
Yes.
country. And it was one of the great moments in the history of freedom, I think, in the United States of America.
Yes.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely. And just a very short anecdote. I think Angela, Margaret and I were speaking at maybe the 30th anniversary or something like that of your acquittal. And we were each sharing our perspectives. And I said something like, I never had any doubt that my sister would be free. I never had any doubt. And afterward, Angela and Margaret just kind of chewed me out. What are you talking about? What you know, we were scared. And you know you were scared. You're just revising history. And I said, no. And then I reminded them, I said, you were in the courtroom every day when those hundreds of exhibits were coming in, all of the guns, all of the gory pictures of the bodies with the judge, and you were hearing all of the witnesses, the so-called eyewitnesses. But where was I? Mm-hmm. I was out in the streets, you know. I was at demonstrations of tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands all over the world. I was not allowed actually in the courtroom because I was a potential witness.
Right.
And so we were sequestered.
Right.
So the power of movement is what I get from her life. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panelists for honoring the legacy of Angela Davis's life and work.
Thank our panelists, thank our presenters for an absolutely unforgettable evening. We will see those of you who are registered tomorrow morning, bright and early, same place. Thank you so much.